welcome back to Perth City Talks special edition Jesus on Trial. Ian, how do you find the evening?
Well, it's probably more a question for those who are listening. I enjoyed the evening, but it's perhaps a question for those who are having to hear us. Well, obviously we submitted that the evidence was overwhelming, but we will have to wait the verdict of the jury, who are the triers of fact. So, but we hope we've put something cogent for them to listen and consider.
Do you think with your team of two, you'll be able to convince the jury?
Well, we'll find out in due course.
Paul, it was a successful night?
Yeah, it was a fantastic night. I loved that there was so much depth to both of the witnesses and what they presented, and threads for people to pursue, and that the emphasis on the end was that we have to make our own decision and to read Acts on Martin's request and to read the Gospels on Ian's requests and make up our own mind.
And why was that necessary to have this forum or that trial in the 21st century?
Well, I think a lot of people have never read the Gospel as an adult. I know that I got to 19 and hadn't read any of the Gospels, and when I did read them, I was surprised. But, by the time I was 4, I knew that courts were a good way to make decisions, and that the laws of evidence that we developed in our courts really help us on not just contemporary events, but, with historical questions. Did Tibor killed this man 2 weeks ago? Was Jesus seen alive after being successfully crucified 2,000 years ago?
So why you came here tonight, Daniel?
I found out about this through Paul. He and I know each other. We actually have an atheist Christian book club where we discuss these issues. So I'm on the atheist side. I've never heard that you could be an atheist Christian. I know that you could be an agnostic Christian. I myself am an agnostic atheist.
That's a nice combination.
It's great. The atheist part means I don't believe that there is a God, but the agnostic part means I don't think you can settle it one way or the other.
How do you settle finally on this issue of resurrection of Jesus?
Well, I was aware that the evidence for the resurrection wasn't particularly strong, but I was quite surprised to find how really weak it was. People who weren't eyewitnesses, confabulations coming after decades, and the idea that there were 500 people who were alleged to have seen Jesus, version 2, but later on there were only 150 believers. That's some attrition rate.
So we are tonight looking for some evidence or some guidance on the resurrection?
They are putting forward evidence to persuade the audience that the resurrection happened as a matter of historic reality. And we are saying the historical evidence is very problematic, either in historical terms or in legal terms, because most of it's hearsay. We're also saying that if you assume that it's all trustworthy, so we get over the authenticity problem, the events that are described there can be explained in non-supernatural ways, in natural ways. There are strange but real-world explanations for what we read there.
Except for the healings of all the wounds for one day and have Jesus just walking like a healthy man?
Well, is it Jesus? You see, we have nothing approaching medical evidence to identify the new person with the old person, if I can use those terms. You know what I mean? We have a person, the new Jesus, who is not recognised on, I think, on all of the initial occasions that he appears, including that bizarre period when he's walking with 2 disciples along the road for some hours. They're talking. They're as close as you and I are. And after some hours, they don't recognise that it's Jesus. So how do we know?
But are these disciples the original one from the 13 or from the 150 or from how many?
It was 2 of them, I thought. Yeah, 2 of the original. Well, there were 11 at that stage because Judas had retired. So, but also you go back to the very first appearance, which is close to the tomb, to Mary Magdalene. She doesn't recognise Jesus at first. She thinks he's the gardener. So you have these. It's not a case of it's Jesus. Far from it. So, and we certainly have nothing like DNA evidence or even basic medical evidence to show that The new one is the matching the old, yeah, that's right. The one that I prefer is that Joseph of Arimathea, for some reason, decided to move the body on the first night. Now, on any version, there was no guard there on the first night. He was entitled to open that tomb. If he was caught doing it, he would not have been in any trouble, whereas if anybody else was caught doing it, they could be executed. Serious crime, right? Now, my friend said in his questioning, you might have heard, well, Joseph was a Jew, he shouldn't be doing anything like that on the Sabbath. And one reason Mr. Davidson said that was I told him that last night as one of the arguments. So the idea is, well, do people never break the rules? Do we say, no, this obvious possibility that he moved the body must be excluded because he wouldn't break the rules of an Orthodox Jew? Or, as well, could he say, I won't touch the body, but I'll get my servants to. Boys, you know. Now, all that's quite possible. You might think it's unlikely. Why would he move it? Well, he might have thought, instead of putting it here, I'll put it here. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons. But the point is a miracle that the idea of the body getting through the tomb somehow in a miraculous way is not a compelling explanation, especially when it is found with the door open just as a person would have opened it to get into it. If it was truly miraculous, you would have had the body gone in, it's definitely in there, the door stays shut, and the door's opened and the body's gone. Now that would be rather more thought-provoking. That's the story that Matthew would like to tell. He would like to tell that because he'd like to come along and say, well, the tomb was guarded for most of the time, and then there was an earthquake and thunder, door is opened, it's gone. It must have got through the walls. See, he likes the miraculous version, but the other three don't tell that. They describe a tomb that looks just the way it would look if some people had come along and either robbed it or opened it up legally and taken the body out.
So, Judge Martin.
Hello.
How do you feel after this knowledge?
Exhausted. There was a lot to watch over and assimilate, and you find the process of a trial is a lot of concentration, and you can't really drop your concentration for a moment because things happen in trials. So, I'm delighted that it seemed to go so well and be received so well by the jury, but I'm exhausted.
And who do you find most interesting, or which argument?
I think all the arguments are interesting, and the thing that I enjoy the most about this process is that the jury is going to deliver the decision and not me. I find that in most of my trials I'm the one who has to write the judgment. So here the jury is going to deliberate and my job is done.
Have you felt that history against versus philosophy, it was a bit of a challenge?
Yes, exactly, and not unexpected that an ancient historian would take a particular view, and that a philosopher with a deep interest in science would come to a contrary point of view. In fact, they were perfect for their respective positions. But, I've studied history myself, and, if you study the Tudors and the Stuarts, again, you see similar sorts of rival accounts depending upon the reliability of sources that are used, and the ruling class at the time tends to write a version that's acceptable to the ruling class, and maybe it takes a couple of centuries before the influences that led you to a particular perspective on history are evaluated more neutrally. So it's a fascinating process.
So being a scientist and a philosopher, how do you feel about the night?
Tonight? Well, I thought it was great. It was a nice exchange. I think we covered the issues as they should be, confronting the historical issues with what I think are the relevant alternative accounts. So I think that's how the debate should go. So I thought it was very nice.
What's your opinion, finally, on the resurrection of Christ?
Well, I think the evidence is doubtful just on the historical basis. Just leaving aside the miracle, any scholar of the history will point out how complex and tenuous, just on the basis of historical evidences, documents and so on. But of course the trump card is that science says that whatever the history tells you, it couldn't have happened as it's reported. Or at least the main point is that, as I said in the court case, even if you grant all of the history, which is granting too much because it's not reliable. But if you grant everything that is purely the observational facts of the tomb and all that, it still doesn't give you a miracle. It means that people saw something they couldn't understand. And then the question is how many other explanations you can devise, and everybody knows you can think of all sorts of ones. And if they're consistent with our science, then they're to be preferred. They're the most plausible. It was described as that they're far-fetched or they're fanciful, but they're not more fanciful than the miracle. Which is the most fanciful? You pick the least fanciful miracle, even if they're very far-fetched. We watch enough movies to know that there's all sorts of surprising explanations for what appear to be the facts, and you don't resort to the most miraculous, the most unlikely one, the most fanciful one.
So what do you think in the 21st century why more than 1 billion people believe in Christ, God and the resurrection?
Well, but people believe a lot of other things as well. There are a lot of Muslims who don't accept that. They believe that Jesus was a prophet, but not a son of God. There are Buddhists and any number of people, Hindus, that believe all sorts of different things. Now, that's an interesting question of sociology and psychology and history, and there are all sorts of good reasons why people believe things, often out of lack of sufficient scientific knowledge, where they're mostly not scientifically literate or don't know enough. There are scientifically sophisticated people that also believe, so there's a lot of different explanations. The question is evidence in the end, and the question is not how many people believe, but really what the grounds are.
So what do you think, what will be the decision of the jury?
Well, that's a good question. I'm biased. I think I know what they should decide, but
What they will do, really?
Well, look, it's too hard to predict because they have to judge it on the basis of what they know and how they fit the testimonies into their picture. What they find plausible may not be what I've offered as grounds. They have to weigh. Mind you, they were instructed not to bring to the decision their own personal background and beliefs and emotional commitments. That's hard for people to do always. And let's say somebody is a committed Christian. I've had this experience before where even committed Christians will recognise that sometimes the arguments on the atheist side are good arguments or better arguments. People often say they believe independently of the evidence, they have faith and they give other grounds. So they may well accept that the argument was, let's say on our side, was even better, which I think it was. But they might say that, well, it doesn't, as they often do say, that it doesn't change their commitment because in some sense it's not based on evidence, it's some faith or... I don't think it's a very good answer, by the way, but the people often say that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
And thanks for you to watching WTV University Talks.